Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Carroll County League of Women Voters meeting this evening, and we are delighted to have as our speaker on redistricting Dr. Claire Abernathy. And I am going to call on Robin to introduce Claire, if you will, please, Robin.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good,
And
great.
you want to remind people about muting? I forgot.
Well, yes, I will remind people about muting. It's going to be best if you, even if you're on the telephone, for you to mute your phone so that we don't hear what's happening in your room. I have two little yappy dachshunds, and I'm sure you don't want to hear that. So be sure to mute. When it comes time for questions, then you can unmute or just unmute while you are asking a question. And usually that's easiest done by just pressing your space bar. So, okay, Dr. Abernathy, I have known Dr. Abernathy since before she was born. She's one of my best friend's daughter, and she is now a Dr. Abernathy, and she's an assistant professor of political science at Stockton University in New Jersey. She teaches introductory and upper level courses in American politics, including courses on the president, Congress, campaigns and elections, interest groups, and voting in the United States. She currently serves as the faculty chair of Stockton's American Democracy Project and Political Engagement, which is a nonpartisan committee that develops programs on a range of different timely political and policy issues that are designed to increase political awareness and engagement. So now that I've introduced her, we'll start out and have Dr. Abernathy speak, and then afterwards, I believe we'll have questions and answers, okay?
Yes, thank you so much, Robin. It's great to be joining you all tonight. And I really have known Robin my whole life, so I was just thrilled to be able to accept this invitation and speak to you all tonight. So now is a really excellent time to be thinking about redistricting. We sit at the start of the 2021 redistricting cycle, though, of course, as you all know, due to delays with the census, which we could talk about some more later if you'd like, states have yet to receive their census data. So redistricting is not yet underway, but it is on the horizon. So it's a really good time to check in about it. So the problems of redistricting in the United States are well known. The process now commonly results in districts that have been gerrymandered in order to benefit a party or interest, and in districts that are not competitive and will simply stay in the hands of one party or one incumbent. In practice, these partisan gerrymandered districts mean that parties are able to translate their votes into seats more effectively. That is, the party's share of seats in Congress or in the state legislature is much larger than its share of the vote in the elections would actually warrant. So, for example, in 2012, in states where Democrats were in control of redistricting, Democratic candidates for Congress won 56% of the vote in the state, but actually picked up 71% of the seats from that state in Congress. Similarly, in 2012, in states where Republicans had been in control of the redistricting process, Republican candidates for Congress won 53% of the vote in the state and picked up 72% of the seats in Congress from that state. So that shows the sort of model of how partisan gerrymander works in practice, that you take a sort of lower vote share and you're able to translate it into a more secure set of seats. So these gerrymandered districts use a couple of different methods. They pack people together to concentrate their political power in one district and keep them out of others, or they crack people across different districts, spread people across different districts to dilute their political power, resulting in groups not being adequately represented in proportion to their actual share in the population. So the outcomes of redistricting then are clear and raise important issues of fairness and representation. and the processes through which redistricting happens in the US, including who is charged with drawing maps and what mechanisms, if any, are in place to allow public input as those maps are drawn, also raise several issues. And those processes are going to be the main focus of my remarks tonight. So I'm going to get started tonight with the talk by sort of laying out the basic process that the majority of states, including Georgia, use to draw new state legislative and congressional district boundaries. And then I'll introduce different methods that are in use in other states. I'll then focus a little bit more on a few of these methods, particularly advisory committees and independent commissions, which could represent reforms other states could adopt. And then I'll also consider other potential ways to reform the redistricting process, including by imposing criteria for what data can be used to inform map making or what standards maps need to meet. Now, there's far more about redistricting to talk about than I'll have time to get to, but I do look forward to exploring some of these issues in my talk and then further during a Q&A. Okay, so in the majority of states, the process, the responsibility for redrawing congressional and state legislative district boundaries lies with the state legislature. 34 state legislatures have primary control over drawing their own state legislative district boundaries, and 39 state legislatures have primary control over drawing congressional district boundaries for their state. In most of these states, district lines pass just like regular legislation with a majority vote in each legislative chamber of the state legislature. And the first draft is usually done by legislative committees chosen by legislative leadership. Typically, the bills passing new district maps are subject to veto by the governor, but that could also, in most states, be overridden by legislators. Georgia is actually fairly typical of this redistricting process, as in most states, the power to draw Georgia's legislative and congressional districts rests with the legislature. The Legislative and Congressional Reapportionment Committee in the State House and the State Reapportionment and Redistricting Committee in the State Senate are responsible for developing the maps in the state of Georgia. These districts are drawn by statute, meaning that they need to pass by simple majorities in each chamber, and they can be vetoed by the governor. In Georgia, there are no statutory requirements for public input to be sought as maps are developed, and the legislative redistricting committees in the state legislature have not yet announced any specific plans or guidelines for public input during the current 2021 redistricting cycle that's about to start. However, in August of 2020, an announcement from the Georgia House Budget and Research Office stated that public hearings will also be held throughout the state to get input. So I would just put that on your radar as something to look for announcements about hearings throughout the state that are planned but not yet announced. So this process that happens in Georgia through the state legislature, like I said, is typical of what a lot of states do, with the involvement of partisan legislatures, of course, being sort of central to the partisan gerrymandering of districts, right? Partisan lawmakers tend to draw partisan boundaries that benefit their own political party. And this process also tasks state legislators with drawing district maps for their own political fates, right? They're drawing the legislative boundaries for their own districts during the redistricting process. And often maps are being drawn in these states with very little transparency or public input. So the problems inherent in these processes are clear, right? They place the people who stand to benefit from redrawn boundaries in charge of creating them, and they limit opportunities for other viewpoints to be heard as part of the process. But this is not how every state approaches redistricting. Though the majority of states do center redistricting authority within the state legislature, this is not the only model. Not all states approach redistricting this way. So I want to dedicate the majority of my remarks to different ways other states approach redistricting and reflecting on how these other methods might promote transparency or create opportunities for public input, and as an ultimate goal, result in maps that afford people fair and equal representation. So first, there are some states where state legislatures are in charge of redistricting, but they utilize other mechanisms to support the development of district maps. So there are 8 states, including Connecticut, Illinois, Maryland, Mississippi, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, and Texas, that have backup procedures to draw state district lines if the legislature can't successfully pass a plan. Usually, if the legislature fails to pass a plan by a specific deadline, the backup process is automatically triggered. And these processes can take many different forms, right? So if a state fails to develop maps through their state legislature in a state with this backup process, it might fall to the governor to develop a map. It might fall to the Secretary of State. It might fall to other members of legislative leadership. It might fall to other statewide elected officials. So the form that this backup process takes varies, but this backup process isn't always triggered. So it doesn't always serve as a counterweight to state legislative power to draw maps. And importantly, the backup processes that I've just listed out usually vest map-making power with other politicians or elected officials, right? Instead of the legislature drawing it, it's the governor or the Secretary of State or other statewide officials. So it may replicate some of the same concerns that occur with maps drawn by state legislators. 4 states that allow their legislatures to take primary responsibility for drawing maps also employ advisory commissions to help the legislator develop those maps. That's Iowa, Maine, Utah, and Vermont. These states that have advisory committees bring in non-legislators to formally participate in the initial drafting of district maps. These advisory commissions recommend district plans to the legislature or work directly with the state legislature to draw maps, but the legislature still has the final say. These advisory commissions can vary in their design, but by intentionally bringing non-legislators into the process, they can broaden the input that is brought into the map-making process. We'll actually return to the example of Iowa in a few minutes because they have an advisory committee there that is particularly strong and a little more independent than some others. So those were examples of states that still empower the state legislature to draw the maps, but have these sort of other bodies that work with and support them in developing those maps. Some states, however, invest redistricting authority in separate commissions. So first we're going to look at states that use politician commissions. So 7 states, Arkansas, Hawaii, Missouri, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, draw state legislative districts using politician commissions where elected officials can serve as members of this map drawing commission. Who is appointed to serve on these commissions varies for each state. In some states, there's specific elected officials that are designated to be on this redistricting commission. In other states, the legislative or party leadership of state legislatures nominates people to serve on a redistricting politician commission. These politician commissions remove the full state legislature from the development of maps, but they often still include members of the state legislature who are appointed to the commission. Because partisan officials might still be able to serve on these commissions, they may not be insulated from the partisan influence that characterizes the state legislative-driven process. Finally, there are some states that use what are referred to as independent commissions. 9 states, Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Michigan, Montana, New York, and Washington, all draw both their state and congressional district boundaries using an independent commission, and there are regulations limiting the direct participation of elected officials on those commissions. So members of these commissions are not legislators or public officials, Most of these states also ban people who serve on the Independent Redistricting Commission from running for office in the districts that they're drawing, at least for several years after the commission finishes its work. And some states place even further limits on commissions, whether commission members can have any sort of ties to the legislature, barring former legislative staff or lobbyists from serving on the commission. So the idea with these independent commissions is to bring in non-politicians and, to the extent possible, kind of typical citizens into the process of drawing congressional and state legislative district maps. These independent commissions are sometimes referred to as citizen commissions, and they invest non-politicians with the task of drawing district boundaries, removing or at least lessening the role of partisan or political incentives that might influence map making, especially in those states that bar lobbyists, legislative staffers, and public officials from serving on them. So I've just gone through quite a few different variations of redistricting models that we see across different states. I'm dropping in the chat for those of you who are here on the Zoom a link to the Loyola Law School at Loyola Marymount University, where they've assembled a really good resource that looks at the redistricting process in all 50 states. So if you want to learn more about any of those processes I just talked about, I just dropped a link in the chat that, that can give you everything you'd want to know about everything happening in all 50 states. I do want to focus now a little bit more on some of the systems that I've just looked at, right? Like the advisory committee in Iowa and independent commissions, and then consider one other potential way to reform redistricting. So let's start by talking a little bit more about Iowa. So Iowa is one of those states that has an advisory committee. So their state legislature is tasked with drawing congressional and state legislative district lines, but they do so with substantial input from a nonpartisan advisory body in the state legislature and a bipartisan advisory committee. So the nonpartisan advisory body that supports the Iowa process is called the Legislative Services Agency. And this is a body of civil servants who are nonpartisan. And they do a lot of work for the state legislature in Iowa on other tasks like fiscal analysis, state budget analysis, that kind of thing. But every 10 years when it comes to redistricting, they are charged with preparing draft redistricting plans. And they have some criteria provided by state law that they have to follow. So they have to draw districts that are of equal population, that are compact and contiguous. We'll talk about those terms in a moment, and that respect existing political boundaries, things like county lines. The Legislative Services Agency cannot reference political data on proposed districts. They can't look at the partisan makeup of the proposed district they'd be drawing, and they can't look up where incumbents currently in office are living. So they are limited from considering some important political data. But in cases where the Legislative Services Agency has some discretion, they work with a 5-person independent commission, none of whose members can be holding partisan elected office. This 5-member independent commission works with the Legislative Services Agency to draw up maps for congressional and state legislative districts. And together they submit their fully developed maps to the Iowa State Legislature, which can then accept or reject them. If they're rejected, the Legislative Service Agency and Independent Commission can then redraw them. They have kind of another shot. They have actually 2 more opportunities to submit maps to the state legislature for approval. And this process has been in place in Iowa since 1980. And each time they have conducted redistricting, the Iowa State Legislature has approved the maps of this nonpartisan advisory committee and independent commission. So it has been a very effective process in Iowa. And in fact, this redistricting process tends to result in competitive congressional districts for the state. Some of you are probably following the elections in Iowa this year. There were some really close ones in House races for the House of Representatives. So in 2020, 3 out of the 4 congressional district races in Iowa were decided by 3 points or less. Those close margins are really typical of Iowa's congressional districts. The maps that they draw result consistently in competitive elections. And this is something that Iowan politicians from both parties have actually celebrated. So former Republican governor of Iowa, who served 2 different tenures, Terry Branstad, is quoted as saying, having a more competitive district encourages someone to really try to represent not just the ideology of his or her party, but to represent the people of the district. Right. So this process in Iowa does not necessarily entail enhanced public input or transparency, right? It's still happening within this kind of body related to the state legislature. But by placing the central decisions about maps in the hands of nonpartisan and independent bodies, the Iowa redistricting process consistently produces competitive maps where both political parties can compete and have a real chance of winning a seat in a given year. So I want to take also a closer look at independent commissions. Right, as we talked about earlier, there are 9 states that employ independent commissions to draw district boundaries. And these independent commissions specifically limit involvement from politicians. So Arizona, for example, uses a 5-member independent commission and has done so since it was passed by ballot initiative by the voters of Arizona in 2000. For 3 years before their appointment to this independent commission, none of the members of the commission could have served for any in any public office, been a lobbyist, or even worked for another candidate's campaign. So they have to be non-politicians, right? The commission in Arizona is required to make draft maps available for 30 days of public comment. And in the 2010 cycle, they actually held 3 months of public meetings across the state to seek public input. So independent commissions like this that I've described in Arizona and that are in place in 9 states are often looked at as strong potential reforms that would produce fairer maps by removing the power from the hands of politicians altogether. However, I want to focus on some potential pitfalls that could arise in how independent commissions actually operate by looking at the process that happened in California following the 2010 census. So before the 2010 redistricting cycle, California voters passed a ballot initiative giving an independent commission authority to draw state and congressional district boundaries. It created a 14-member independent commission that restricted service for anyone who was in public office or had served as a lobbyist for 10 years prior to joining the commission. So it was truly an effort at a citizen commission in order to draw district lines. And to the extent possible, the California Commission was charged with preserving the geographic integrity of cities, counties, neighborhoods, and communities of interest when drawing district lines. And in 2010, the commission in California made an interesting decision by agreeing ahead of time not to reference any data on the political implications or the partisan breakdown of the maps that they were drawing. So that wasn't a requirement by the state. It wasn't included in the ballot measure voters passed in California, but the commission imposed that requirement on themselves. They said, we're not going to look at partisan breakdown of the maps we're drawing. The California process was also set up specifically to incorporate public input. And during the 2010 cycle, the California Redistricting Commission held extensive hearings in 9 different regions in the state and heard from more than 2,700 witnesses. California Democratic leaders began organizing almost immediately as the commission started its work for the 2010 cycle. They were looking to influence the process by identifying and defending the communities of interest that the redistricting board had to look at. So Democrats organized individuals in communities across the state to present testimony and proposed maps for communities of interest, and tried to sway the Redistricting Commission to make maps that Democrats favored by presenting as individual citizens at these public hearings. The testimony that Democrats coordinated this way included draft maps, and it was highly valued in what was a fairly chaotic process for the brand new Redistricting Commission. They received an overwhelming flood of advice, and they had limited resources. They weren't really able to sift through all of the testimony and input they were receiving to tell if what they were hearing was coming from organized groups or parties, or if it was really organic input from the community. So unbeknownst to the Redistricting Commission, they ultimately enacted maps that very closely aligned with what Democratic Party leaders wanted. And they did that by following what Democratic Party supporters had suggested when they appeared as community members at hearings across the state. So that 2010 experience in California makes clear that independent commissions can, even with the best intentions, fall prey to partisan efforts to shape districts, right? Independent commissions require funding and effective organization, and the ability to examine or follow up on what's being presented at hearings, right? The new California Independent Commission in place in 2010 didn't have the resources or expertise to see that there was a coordinated campaign by Democrats happening in the state. And in fact, by deciding not to look at the partisan effects of their maps, they barred themselves from looking at the exact kind of data that could have alerted them to the Democrats' efforts to shape maps in their favor. So I focus on that California example because so often independent commissions are talked about as a very reasonable way to think about reforms to redistricting, but they have to be granted sufficient resources to conduct their work, right? And when they have those resources, it can increase opportunities for public input if you have an independent commission, right? This happens inherently by involving non-politicians in the map making work. And it also happens by those commissions following public hearing processes. The selection of the voices that are going to serve on those commissions can also be done in a way that places an emphasis on diversity and inclusion. In fact, in California, the process for selecting members for their commission explicitly states that they should reflect the diversity of the state as a criteria for being selected to the Redistricting Commission. So those are two kind of more structural reforms to the actual process, instituting an independent commission like California or Arizona, or adopting an advisory committee to support the work of the state legislature. But there are other ways you could introduce reform to redistricting simply by changing some of the criteria that those drawing maps, even if they're in a state legislature, changing the criteria that they have to adhere to. So right now, there are relatively limited criteria that are typically used to guide the development of state legislative and congressional district maps. The most common criteria include equal population, that each district must have about the same population size. And that's to correct issues with malapportionment. We could talk a little bit more about that if you guys would like. Other criteria that are in place now include compactness. That is kind of the extent to which a district's geography is tightly dispersed around its center, that doesn't have kind of tentacles reaching out in all different directions. Contiguity is another common criteria, that you can essentially travel from one point in the district to any other point without leaving the district. And districts now should not dilute minority political power. This is a requirement in line with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that requires districts not be drawn in a way that dilutes the representation of racial or language minorities. So those are dominant criteria that are used in states. And in fact, equal population and those minority considerations under the Voting Rights Act have both been specifically enforced by courts or by statutes. But states could adopt other criteria that maps have to adhere to, right? So for example, in 2010, Florida voters passed a state constitutional amendment that banned the creation of state legislative districts with the intent to favor or disfavor a political party or an incumbent. This constitutional amendment also required that districts be drawn for equal population compactness and to follow existing political boundaries. But the real sort of meat of this constitutional amendment was essentially to try to ban partisan gerrymandering in the state, right? Ban the creation of legislative districts that favor or disfavor a political party. Additionally, you could see states identify provisions that are already in state law or in the state's own constitution that could be applied to district maps. So if you remember a couple of years ago in 2018, Pennsylvania's congressional maps, which had been drawn in 2011, were found by the state Supreme Court to be in violation of the state of Pennsylvania's constitution and their existing guarantee that elections shall be free and equal. In the majority opinion in the case, which was brought by the Public Interest Law Center for the Plaintiff League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, the majority opinion stated that an election corrupted by extensive, sophisticated gerrymandering and partisan dilution of votes is not free and equal. Right, so these examples from Florida and Pennsylvania don't show any changes in the process governing redistricting, but rather they identify or impose new criteria that district maps must follow, right? By limiting partisan gerrymandering or requiring districts to respect existing boundaries, these criteria, like in Florida, constrain the districts that can be produced and are likely to yield fairer maps. And state constitutions might already have provisions, as in the Pennsylvania case, that could be used to challenge gerrymandered maps, even without instituting new criteria through statute or ballot measures. Okay. So these particular requirements could be seen as a transparency mechanism, right? Spelling out how a state needs to draw their maps. Okay. So I want to shift to Q&A in just a moment and engage with you all a little bit and think some about these reforms and these issues that they raise. But first, I want to think a little bit about what to do now for 2021, right? We're about to get to redistricting in Georgia and across the country. And the processes that I've just gone through required the adoption of institutional reforms, right? Usually through state constitutional amendments. So those represent longer term changes, right? So Virginia, for example, just passed a new redistricting reform in November 2020, but it took years of work from organizers and community groups to advance that change. So I recognize a lot of what I just went through are sort of the long term of what redistricting could look like. But I think for the current round of redistricting, a focus on thinking about what's happening in Georgia, drawing public attention or educating people about what the process is, telling people when there is information about public hearings, coordinating attendance at them, raising awareness about public hearings, sharing with people what they should say at a redistricting public hearing. Individuals in every state can also draft their own maps to submit and make suggestions. It can just be for your own little neighborhood. It doesn't have to be a map for the whole state. to present arguments for why this community should be kept together when you're making your redistricting decisions. And finally, I'll suggest one thing that I've seen done here in New Jersey. Actually, the League of Women Voters in New Jersey a couple of years ago held redistricting forums. These were focused on reform. And they held them across the state in 2018. My university, Stockton University, partnered with the League of Women Voters to host one of these on our campus. And these forums were about raising awareness and getting public input on redistricting reform ideas. They sought out qualitative and quantitative input. There was a survey that everyone at these forums completed. And they collected all of this input from forums across the state and shared it with the state legislature. So I think while that was an effort by the League of Women Voters of New Jersey focused on generating ideas for reform, a similar effort could be developed that would focus on gathering public input on redistricting itself and what kind of maps to draw in Georgia. I definitely wanted to highlight that because it was such an impressive program they put on here. And I think it would have real potential to help increase the public input that is part of this process. So I'll stop there and gladly open up to any and all questions, comments, anything you all would like to talk further about.
Now, in order to ask a question, you can do a couple of things. You can unmute yourself and just jump right in, or you can put a question in the chat. We have somebody that's looking for questions in the chat, or raise your hand and try to recognize you. Again, if you unmute yourself, remute yourself, and you can do that easily by just pressing the space bar. So who has our first question?
I threw too much information at you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Could you just clarify a little bit? I know you gave us a lot of information about the independent, I think it's called redistricting committees. And you noted that you cannot be a politician and be a part of those for the most part. Did you say that that time period is 10 years, or was that for a specific state? If someone was a politician in, say, 2015, depending on that particular state, they could not serve on this independent redistricting commission?
Right. So each state that has these, so the 9 states that have them, have their own requirements for how long you could have been out of public office. So I mentioned specifically the examples of Arizona and California, like dug into those a little bit. Arizona, you can't have been a political official for 3 years before getting appointed. So if in this example, if you'd been on something in 2015 in Arizona, but weren't in office anymore, you would be eligible. But California has a longer time period. Theirs is 10 years. You cannot have been a public official in any way for 10 years before being appointed. I will say most of the states have something closer to Arizona, where it's 3 or 5 years before that you can have been a public official, but need to have at least 3 to 5 years of not being in office before you can be on the commission.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Well, I'll ask a question. Claire, have you heard about computer programs that begin the redistricting process? Now, 10 years ago when I studied this, someone talked about a computer program that was being developed. Have you heard anything about that?
So there are, I think actually one of the reasons why we've seen sort of gerrymandering become so sophisticated and so much more prominent in the last several cycles is because of the increasing sophistication of software that state legislatures can use to really finely draw maps in a way that 30 years ago would have been much more difficult. So those are absolutely in practice by those charged with drawing maps right now. I actually personally use a like a teaching tool that has you work to draw your own maps just to help people understand how gerrymandering works. So there are like educational tools like that out there, and I'm certain that there are others that you can use to sort of create your own map and try to submit to your elected officials and influence the process that way. But I'm not aware of a sort of large scale effort to try to empower individual citizens through those kind of tools. But I think there could be a lot of promise there because it's now so much more accessible for, you know, our whole lives happen on Zoom now, right? Like we're all connected a lot more than we used to be. And so making tools like that available to citizens as a way to easily submit input into the redistricting process that's happening in state legislatures or commissions would be a really promising, I think, innovation and a way for each of us to be more involved in the process. I think I might have seen Barbara.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
What would be the process in Georgia where we have the state legislatures drawing up the maps? What would be the process for citizens to initiate a change here? How do we get from that to an independent commission?
Yes, I will say that in most places that have adopted independent commissions, they've done so by ballot initiative or a constitutional amendment to the state constitution initiated by voters. I do not actually know the process that goes through in the state of Georgia. It varies from state to state what's possible, how many signatures you would need to get to have something like that happen. But it is getting these reforms passed. You raise a really good point, is a big challenge because the people with the power now are the ones that would have to give it away, right? So the state legislators themselves are perfectly happy to keep drawing their own district lines, right? They enjoy having that power and they would prefer to retain it. And so that's why you see most of the time when these reforms do go forward, that it's happening through a voter initiated constitutional amendment or ballot initiative. So that was even the case in the state of Florida, where I was mentioning they imposed a new requirement that you couldn't draw districts to favor or disfavor a party. They even did that through a constitutional amendment led by voters. So a lot of changes to this process have been through a voter initiated reform process like that. So I should have looked into the specific process in Georgia before hopping on with you guys, but I do think that is the most promising route to push for like an institutional change like that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've all actually studied, you know, what's happening in Georgia before and other Zoom calls and meetings. But if you are curious and you want to see about Georgia, Ballottopedia has a good page about redistricting in Georgia. And that includes information about the history. That's part of the problem in Georgia, is that one particular party thinks the other particular party hasn't been fair, and then the other particular party says, you know, then that party wasn't fair. So it's been a little bit of a back and forth process, and I would think that some changes are need, you know, coming up.
Mm-hmm. So I saw a hand raised, but Julie Boland just popped a question in the chat that I can speak to. So Julie asked if Florida actually did make a difference in preventing gerrymandering. So voters passed that requirement to try to stop Florida from gerrymandering their districts in 2010. The state of Florida then, like everyone else, redrew their district maps in 2011, and the state legislature just ignored that constitutional amendment, okay? But voters in the state of Florida filed suit against them and said, hey, we just passed that constitutional amendment that said you couldn't do this anymore. And in 2014, a Florida judge threw out the maps and said, yes, there's now this constitutional requirement that you can't draw these to favor or disfavor a political party, and you need to redraw several of these districts. So it didn't change the immediate behavior of the state legislature, but it did result in a redrawing of maps in the state of Florida that were more in line with the requirements of that amendment. So I thought that that's heartening, right? That it maybe didn't change the immediate behavior of the legislature, but it did actually come to fruition through legal challenges. So Paul, yes, Paul.
Helen.
I see. I only see the name Paul, so I apologize for that.
So, I'm really curious if maybe you have any insights into Georgia's specific districts. Do we have some major issues that you can see or have heard of for the state and congressional districts?
So that is a good question that I actually don't think I can answer well. I grew up in Georgia, but I'm now based in New Jersey, so I could tell you a lot about what New Jersey's districts are like right now. So that's what I teach about. But I do think that similar to districts or states that have the system in place that Georgia does, where it's the state legislature tasked with drawing the boundaries, they are drawn, like many other places, in a way that favors the party who got to draw the boundaries. And in Georgia, that was the Republican Party in 2011, and that's still reflected in the way the lines are drawn right now. And like I said, that's the case in whatever party is in power at the time they draw districts, tends to draw districts that are going to help their party. Democrats and Republicans both do it. But in the state of Georgia, they are favoring Republicans now, given that they were in charge of the redistricting process last time around.
You can read what you ask.
Anybody else has a question?
I have a question about in Georgia last time they did redistricting, they didn't even tell people in their party. I mean, it was very, very secretive. Mm-hmm. And I think it was, kind of thrust upon the public. I think they probably do some public hearings to appear that they're listening, but I think the work is already done when that happens. Is there anything voters can do to require more transparency, or is it just going to have to go through the legislature to get some legislation requiring transparency? Because in Georgia, we have nothing to fall back on.
Right. So I think pushing for statutes that would require transparency would be a good thing. That would require at least notice of public hearings and maybe updates on what progress is being made, what draft maps are being considered, to get public feedback on them, right? As you were saying, like a lot of the times the maps just come out and that's it, right? An actual process that involved real public input would show you the maps and let you respond to them, right? And have more of a exchange about them. So I think pushing for legislation that would require that in the process would be helpful. For right now, I think some of what a group like the League of Women Voters can do that's really powerful is help people understand that that is all happening right now behind closed doors, and raising awareness about what the process is in order to make other people aware that there could be sort of different processes in place that incorporated public input more meaningfully or had more transparency. I think also gathering and submitting, even if it's not ever formally solicited, right? Like the bodies in Georgia that are drawing the maps are those two committees, right? In the state Senate and the state House. You know that they're the ones tasked with drawing maps. You can contact them with your opinions, whether they're asking for them or not. Right to the chair and vice chair of those committees with your thoughts on not just the process, but this is the kind of map I think my area in Carroll County should have. I think hearing that kind of substantive input maybe isn't something that they're getting that often because they haven't created the space to receive it. But that doesn't mean you can't offer it to them, right?
So in the last election redistricting cycle, the League of Women Voters was instrumental in going to a lot of the meetings. Tracy, are you available to talk about how that happened? You were there at some of the meetings. I was there at some of the meetings. And what we did was we actually wore white shirts and dark bottoms, and we all brought little flashlights, and we said, you know, shine a light on redistricting. And we just wanted them to know that we were watching. But I think what Julie said is correct. I believe it was Julie, that in actuality, you know, they didn't really pay much attention, but we were there.
And we made a big statement as well. Shine the light on redistricting, you know, carries that connotation that they were doing things in secret and private. And then we also went to the Capitol, right, Robin, and looked at the maps after they drew them, but before they were approved by the governor, I believe it is. Yeah. So, but I like Ms. Abernathy, the idea of giving them our input, whether they ask for it or not.
Yeah, and I did see on a flyer from the budget office, like I mentioned earlier, that they're planning to solicit public input at hearings. They haven't announced any schedules, and I imagine it'll look maybe a little more like this, something on Zoom, at least for now, potentially. But I think even before those announcements come out or requests come in, like they're going to be making these district maps, and you know who's going to draw them. They're in those committees. So go ahead and tell them what you think.
Are they required at all to give any reasoning as to legitimate reasoning as to why they want to redistrict?
Okay, good. So why they, well, redistricting is required based on how the population has moved in the 10 years between the previous census and the current census. So there has to be some review of district boundaries. And in some cases, if a state's population has grown, which honestly could be the case in Georgia this cycle, I'm not sure, obviously I haven't seen the census data yet, but if you gain a congressional seat, then you really have to redraw your maps, or if you lose a seat, right, you have to readjust in order to accommodate that. So it's required that it happen, but I think you're getting at a little bit more, do they have to justify where they have placed the boundaries?
Exactly.
Yes, and that's not necessarily required. So there might be pushback when a map comes out, and maybe your small town has been actually divided in two for what seems like no good reason. You might want justification, but they're not actually required to provide that in most states. I think that once a map is produced and voted on and becomes the map of that area, there isn't any sort of paper that goes along with it that says this is how and why we made these decisions. That's a really great question and way to think about transparency in a different way. Like it's not the front end transparency, but it's explaining why you made the decision you did afterwards, so that voters can better understand what went into it and maybe push back against it in the future. But a lot of this process is happening really, as was said by somebody else, kind of behind closed doors and almost in like a black box. You're not sure what criteria they were using or why they were making the decisions they did, and they never really have to tell you.
I remember specifically the things that they seemed to listen to were neighborhoods in Atlanta that gathered together and in a uniform way appealed to have their specific neighborhood. I don't remember the names of any of them, but like if Fairfield, a neighborhood like Fairfield would not want to be divided, and so they would have several people from the community come and say and apply to them and appeal to them not to divide their community.
Yeah, so I think that can be really powerful, that there's a power in numbers there, right? That it's not just me showing up to say, I'd really prefer if the map looked like this. It's my neighborhood coming together and saying, it's really important that we're kept together and here's why. And it's harder then for them to ignore a large number of voices saying that. So I think that as Robin and Tracy, you were both saying, the sort of going and making your presence known at these hearings in numbers and conveying some message. Maybe it's the message of, we think this should be more transparent, but maybe it's a really specific message of, keep my neighborhood together when you're redistricting. Conveying that with a group of people can be more powerful in some ways than just an individual saying that. It helps make the case for, you know, this isn't just something I care about, it's something my whole community cares about, that we see maps that reflect our neighborhood effectively. I do want to just briefly, I'll note, I know we're getting to 7:30 here, but I did want to just say that the census process has obviously delayed this a little bit, right? So usually the redistricting process would be happening in my state up here in New Jersey. We'd be starting it like now because we have off-year state legislative elections. So they try to do our maps in like the very beginning of the year right after the census comes out. And that's being delayed because no one has gotten the census data yet. And that is actually, I think, a good thing because they're doing data reliability checks and making sure that the census data was accurate before sharing it. And they've had some changes in whether they have to count undocumented immigrants or not. Right now, the census count, as it always has, will reflect all persons in the United States, regardless of immigration status. So some of those last minute changes are what's pushing back the census count. And that might mean that some of this redistricting doesn't meaningfully get off the ground until several months later than it usually would in most states. So if you're not hearing talk about it yet in Georgia, if they're not making announcements yet, it's also because they haven't been able to start yet. If they don't have that data, they can't really get started with this process.
Okay, well, that is terrific. I don't really know what time it is. Oh, it's 7:30 on the nose. So thank you so much, Dr. Abernathy. And we're very glad to have you speak to us tonight. And I hope that we can use you as a reference in the future. As we are trying to tell our legislators how it is that we would like things to be done, I think it's great for us to be educated on how things are done in other states. So this is a good beginning, and I, for one, am going to study that sheet that you sent us. I'll put it in an email to the rest of the league members. And if we could call you with questions from time to time, we would appreciate it.
Please do. I know I threw a lot at you because there's a lot of different avenues here for reform or for what could be done right now. So I'm more than happy to continue to be a resource and direct you to other people who know more than I do and try to help in whatever way I can. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, thank you.
Meanwhile, thank you. That was very informative.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.